Nothing on the Bonnell Foundation's Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast should be considered medical advice. Medical advice can only come from your CF physician. Cystic fibrosis can be a devastating diagnosis, but living with the disease can bring positivity and a new appreciation for each day. From the Bonnell Foundation in Detroit, Michigan, it's the Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast, sponsored by Viatris, Genentech, and Vertex. Here's your host, Laura Bonnell.
Dr. Jennifer Taylor Cousar is an amazing woman who I can't wait to meet in person. She is a Board Certified Pediatric and Adult Pulmonologist at National Jewish Health in Colorado. She is a rock star in the world of cystic fibrosis, and she's doing incredible work raising awareness about systemic and individual bias and racism in medicine. She also talks about the importance of representation in the field of medicine, and she has multiple awards and was made chair of the International Conference Committee of American Thoracic Society. She is a huge person in the CF community, someone that all of us look up to and appreciate all that she is bringing to the CF community. We're really excited to have her on this podcast so you can hear more about her. It's wonderful to be able to talk to you one-on-one in this podcast because everyone knows who you are, and I can't wait to meet you in person. I think it will be at the NACFC in November, which I'm really looking forward to. Again, I just can't say enough about you. Everybody that I talk to knows of you, and we all have stories, and we've heard great things. So thanks for coming on this podcast so we can share everything about you, because I think the work that you're doing is really important. So welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
The first thing I guess I wanted to ask is, when did you decide to be a doctor, and when did you decide that you wanted to focus on cystic fibrosis?
So I am the oldest of 4 children and the second oldest of about 13 grandchildren. So when I was a kid, I really liked other kids. I liked babysitting. And then I realized I also like science. So when I was probably like 8 or 9, I decided I was going to be a pediatrician when I grew up. And then when I was in the 8th grade, we had to follow around somebody we thought we might want to be like when we grew up. And so I followed around my mom's friend who was a neonatal ICU nurse, just because I wanted to be in the hospital and she knew her. And I thought the respiratory distress syndrome was really, really interesting in those babies. So I went to med school planning to be a neonatologist. But then I got there and I didn't love that rotation as much. And I had the opportunity as somebody who was internal medicine and pediatrics to do some specialty rotations. And so that's where I met people with CF on the wards, first as an intern and then in clinic. And I love the idea of, as a med peds person, being able to follow people for their whole lives, and also the resilience of people with CF and just their drive for life. The people I worked with, it spoke to me.
That is wonderful. And I'm so glad you're in this field because you're doing so much, and we need you. And I watched a lot of interviews that you were in and read a lot of things. And one thing you said that I think is really important, especially since we're going to be talking about a lot of this, is why representation was important for you, to see yourself through someone else. And if you could talk about why that is so important.
Yes, I think, people think about schools being segregated, but in the 1950s, hospitals were segregated too. And people who were Black or Hispanic or Asian weren't allowed into some of the major organizations that you needed to be involved in to be part of other hospitals. And so for a very long time, there weren't that many people who were trained as physicians who were people of color. And I think that's, in addition to some of the really historical, horrible things that have happened in medicine and research, really eroded the trust of people of color with physicians. And so as a physician of color, I can give you an example of last week's clinic. I had 4 patients who were either Black or Hispanic and 1 patient who was white in my clinic here in Colorado. And Colorado is not that diverse. So it just really reminded me that people want to see someone who looks like them when they're entrusting their lives with them. And one person actually said, the reason I keep coming here, even though I don't really want to, because he's on highly effective modulators and doesn't feel like he needs to come to clinic. He's like, I come because of you, and I can see somebody that looks like me. So it does make a huge difference. And there's data that suggests that if somebody, for example, in the neonatal ICU is taken care of by a person of color and they're a person of color, their mortality is better. And of course, there was a recent publication that showed if there were doctors of color in an area where there are a lot of people of color, again, their outcomes were better. So that trust is really, really important.
And it makes perfect sense to me. I mean, I personally would rather see, I'm white, but I would personally rather see a woman doctor. They get it. They know what they live it, right? I don't have to explain it. So I get that. And I also wonder about representation as far as doctors on television. I think it's only recently, within years, that we are now seeing doctors on television that are African American or Hispanic. It was all white doctors prior to this. There was never a reflection of the community in radio or television.
Yeah, that's so true. And actually, I had this photograph on my wall, or it's really a print that my parents, I begged them to buy from me when I was, again, probably like 8, 9 years old. And it has a picture of a Black physician with 2 Black children. And I literally realized that I carried that with me from the time I was a little kid out to Duke, where I did my medical school residency and fellowship. Before that, I had it on my wall at Stanford as an undergrad, and now it's on my wall at National Jewish. And so I needed that representation, even though as a kid, I probably couldn't have articulated that, but I needed it. And I just carried it with me all across the country and then back to my office here in Denver.
Yeah. And as big of a market as Detroit is, which is where I'm from and where I was a news reporter, there was and there still is a lack of representation, more so in radio than in television, but still, it's still evolving. We're still not even close to where we need to be. And I think it's good for everyone to see multiple different people. Everyone has a different perspective and has so much to offer. So hopefully that's on the road to getting better. And I wanted to talk to you about why are so many people of color still underdiagnosed. I did a podcast with a couple people, Ray Alder and Asia Diaz. Ray was 26 when she was diagnosed, and Asia was 22. And once she was diagnosed, the doctor had her go through a pregnancy without a CF doctor, without a CF clinic. She is the one who figured out that she needed a CF clinic after she gave birth to her twins with pneumonia.
Yeah, it's so disheartening to hear that it continues to happen. I think the reason that it happens is because we teach race-based medicine in every field, respiratory therapists, doctors, nurses, and so that's part of the issue. And so when you see somebody with the classic symptoms, but they're not white, because that's the way it's been taught to be, a disease that only occurs in people who are white, then you just say, oh, well, I'm not going to test for that. And the other issue is that newborn screening is very directed at, again, people who are white, because people looked at the most common variants or mutations that occur in people who are white when they were designing the newborn screen. So lots of people didn't have access to newborn screening before 2010, but since then, we should be able to pick up most people. But the problem is the way the tests were designed, and they're done differently in every state. But generally, they favor diagnosing people who are white and have mutations that are common in people who are white, as opposed to the mutations that occur more commonly in people who are Black, Indigenous, or a person of color. So both ends of the spectrum, on newborn screening and on the person sitting in your clinic, those two things still need to be addressed. And they were built into the system, and so we've got to get them out of the system.
But as much as you're talking about it and we're all talking about it, why are pediatricians still missing it? I just don't understand, truly. Like, we've been screaming it for a while now, it seems. So isn't there an umbrella over pediatricians? Like, can't they disseminate that information? Hey, make sure that you're not dismissing CF in people of color. Like, I really don't understand how it can keep happening.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think part of it is just because it's so built into the system, it's hard to change it. So everyone's learned it over and over and over again until they see it right in front of them. I don't know that it sticks as well. And also, we talk about it a lot in the CF community, but general pediatricians and general internal medicine physicians and nurse practitioners and family practice, like, they just don't get the exposure. I mean, what they learned about CF, they learned in their training, and they just keep moving with that. And unless they're doing some specific continuing medical education on CF, they're not going to have seen the information that we see all the time, and it feels rote to us, but they're just not exposed as well. And I'm actually working with the American Board of Pediatrics to disseminate information very widely across that group next month, in fact.
That's very, very interesting. What does it do to people who are diagnosed so late? I mean, it has to be harmful. I mean, our pediatrician did not initially believe that Molly had cystic fibrosis. She told me I was, a new mom and I should just go back to work. And then a month later, I said, you have to test her. She has every symptom. And thank goodness she started early with enzymes and everything. But all these people who are diagnosed so late in life, in their 20s, and then Terry Wright was 54, they're just so ill by that point.
Yeah, it's a huge issue. There was a recent study by Dr. McCauley and her colleagues looking at newborn screen, and even if someone tested positive for a newborn screen, if the baby was Black, they still got referred later. Now, of course, we didn't talk to the doctors, or they didn't talk to the doctors, so we don't know what the exact problem was, but I suspect it's because they got this positive newborn screen and looked at the child and said, oh, you're Black, that must be wrong, and didn't refer them in the same way they referred a baby who was white. And what they showed was that their weight for age was lower in that group of people who were referred late. And so certainly we know from lots and lots of data at this point that the earlier you diagnose somebody and start treatment, the better they're going to do. And so late diagnosis not only impacts people's health, but again, I think it impacts people's trust of the medical system because they've gone through over and over again and been told, well, no, you just have this or you just have that, and not actually properly diagnosed and treated. And so I think that, again, erodes trust with the medical system.
Well, I just had a thought because I remember when Molly was diagnosed, it was because some of the information that I had read, but also because I was thinking back, my husband and I were thinking, wasn't there a public service announcement? It was on the local TV station. It was a Kiss Your Baby, salty thing. That's what we need to do. So you and I, we're going to do some public service announcements and get that started, because that repetition of telling people, I think, would be something that would be really helpful. Without naming names, obviously, can you tell us how this late diagnosis impacts individuals that you have seen, like what it does to them, what it does to their family? I mean, the stress is unbelievable.
Yeah. One of the very first people I diagnosed here with a late diagnosis was a Southeast Asian man who had a horrible allergic bronchopulmonary aspergillosis, or ABPA, as a child when he was back home in his country. And then when he moved here, he kept getting treated for bronchiectasis as he was getting older. And he had classic things like infertility and pseudomonas and bronchiectasis, although he was pancreatic sufficient. By the time I saw him, his lung function was only 38% of predicted. And he had just undergone in vitro fertilization and assisted reproduction with his wife because he couldn't get her pregnant. And, he was sick all the time. He was on intravenous antibiotics all the time. And he kept getting sicker and sicker. And he was actually in danger of being sent back home because he was on a work visa. And if you can't work, then you can't stay here. And so fortunately, I was able to get compassionate use ivacaftor for him because he had a rare variant, but one that was predicted to be responsive to ivacaftor. And so then he got on ivacaftor and fortunately got much, much better and moved to sea level where it was a little easier to breathe. But so he had been through all of this and not had a diagnosis. It was so stressful for him. And of course, once he found out his diagnosis and he had just had a baby, he's like, please test my baby. I didn't know I had this. Make sure my baby's okay. And his wife and he were very worried about the aspect of possibly being deported. So it was incredibly stressful for them at many, many levels.
That is. And just the fact that sometimes they're so far gone, then they need a lung transplant or have multiple cases of many different health issues, I would think, with all that. And then emotionally, how do you get over that? You've been misdiagnosed. You feel like, I know some people I've talked to felt like, okay, nobody believed them, or they just thought they were making things up, and you're so sick and you're trying to get people to believe you. And even in one case, the hospital, the doctors didn't believe, someone. So you're battling with everything, mental
Right.
and physical.
Yeah, I would think it would be exhausting. It's hard enough to have CF without being told that you don't have it when you actually do.
What about the clinical trials? I think we learned about this more, maybe the whole country got a little bit educated on clinical trials and how it didn't represent the entire population.
Is that better in regard to cystic fibrosis? And where did it start and how is it going today?
So unfortunately, it's not actually better in cystic fibrosis right now. It's a work in progress. So Dr. McGarry looked at this retrospectively, looking back in time, and showed that representation of people of color was much, much lower than their representation in the population. And then we looked at the recent trials for all of the modulators, and it certainly was not any better, unfortunately. I think there are two major issues. One goes back to distrust of the medical system because of historical and ongoing racism, but also people of color are not asked, and they're just assumed to be going to say no. I actually went to a conference and I was participating in this small group about this very issue. And the doctor actually said to me, fortunately, he was being honest, but sad, said, well, I don't usually approach people of color because I know they're just going to say no anyway. And so there's that aspect of it. And then there's some people who are just biased and wouldn't ask. And so it's going to take a lot of us being really incredibly intentional, asking people, making sure that we've rebuilt the trust. And one of the things we talk about a lot with the Therapeutics Development Network is we are now doing gene therapy trials. Well, if you've never asked somebody to be in a trial, asking them to be in a really high risk phase 1 study is not the place to start. So it's really important for us to work on rebuilding that trust and then trying to make sure that the representation is there.
And I mean, there are reasons why African Americans don't want to or are hesitant about, I mean, there's many examples of why people would be hesitant. So there has to be a lot of understanding and a lot of education. And it's on all of us to make sure that happens. I just think it's such a lame excuse to say, well, they would say no anyway. I mean, maybe have a gathering or a meeting or some outreach or something like that. There's always an answer. There's, I mean, education, right?
Right. Education, and again, rebuilding trust. And if you have that trust because they're your patient, that makes a big difference too. I mean, one of the things that has been shown over and over again is that a person is more likely to participate in a trial if they hear about it from their own doctor. And so one of the things that we're working on, again, through the Therapeutics Development Network, is making sure that the physicians know enough about the trial so they can at least mention it. Even if they don't know the details, the researcher could come in and give the details. But talking with patients about these studies, their primary physician is the one who really makes a difference from what people have told us.
Absolutely. And a very good point. And I also read a quote that you talked about where you were saying the Hispanic community is in regard to CF modulators, where there's 10% left in the CF population that, you know, still needs modulators. For African Americans, it only works for 70%. And for the Hispanic community, it's only 76%. Why is that? And how do we change that?
Yeah, again, it just goes back to the whole problem of this being built into the system. I've told this story several times, but when I was reading Breath from Salt by Bijal Trivedi, I noticed in her chapter, she mentioned Dorothy Anderson's paper, which I had read a long, long time ago, but she said something about people of color being mentioned in that paper. So I went back and I reread it. And she actually did say that there was a Black child and a Hispanic child in her seminal first description of the disease paper in 1938. But because it was put into the textbooks that it only occurs in people who are white, the variants that are more common in people of color were not studied and not mentioned. And so therefore, when we went to go put in therapy specifically for mutations, we didn't actually look at mutations that were more common in people of color. So therefore, they weren't put on the label. And so that's part of the issue, is that the variants or mutations that are in people of color more commonly because of their genetic ancestry are not represented in the mutations that were studied in the basic science lab. So it doesn't just affect clinical trials, but this systemic problem also affects the basic science research. So again, we're working on tests to change that. So actually studying more rare variants and trying to get them through the company approved on the label.
As you said, I know in Michigan, so we only test for, in newborn screening, we only test for, I think, 66 mutations. And Dr. Samia Nasser at the University of Michigan is trying to change that. But so many people would be missed. And I'm not sure if it's Texas or which state it is, but one only tests for 4 mutations. And there's about 2,000. So we're definitely missing so many people. And why it isn't the same amount of testing in every state, I'm not exactly sure why, but that's a lot of work to have every state make that change so we can catch more people?
Yes, it's absolutely a lot of work, but absolutely necessary if we're really going to make sure that we're diagnosing everybody early and giving them the best chance of getting treated earlier and longer lives. We really have to change, again, those things that are built in state by state.
And one of the beautiful things that you've done with Michelle and Terry Wright, who they started the National Organization for Cystic Fibrosis in African Americans. And you did this toolkit. Is that what it's called? Did I get the name correct?
So we worked on a screening tool that's patient-facing.
And explain that. And is it helping people?
So we talked about the fact that there is a lot of work to do on the end of re-educating people, changing the textbooks. I mean, honestly, as an editor, whenever I see somebody write, it's the most common disease in Caucasians, I ask them to take it out and rewrite it so that they're not perpetuating this issue. But for the screening tool, we also thought that it's going to take a while to re-educate everybody. And so we should also do it from the patient side. So we worked, basically, Terry thought about some of the signs and symptoms that he was having before he got diagnosed, and we put them on a list, basically, so anybody can access it out in the community and look at the list and say, do I have all of these signs or symptoms or some of them? And if they do, they can take it to their doctor and say, hey, I know that you think that this disease doesn't occur in people like me, but here's this checklist that was created by people in CF and signed off by the education committee at the CF Foundation. And so can you please do a sweat test? So trying to address the issue from the education standpoint, but also giving some advocacy to people so they can self-advocate.
That is great. I should have it on our Bonnell Foundation website. So I will touch base with Michelle and make sure we get that done so that people see that. I mean, we have a page that's in Spanish. We should have the toolkit so people who are African American can see it. It's the same to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's the same as people who are Hispanic. Like, we have some people in Michigan who said getting information from Mexico, it's all inaccurate about cystic fibrosis, and it's very scary and very sad. And there's so little information on our local websites. So we did start that CF Familia page, but there are so many other people that it's important to reach. So we will definitely do that as well. And I'm wondering, is it changing? Like, are you reaching people? Do you find that more people are finding a diagnosis or maybe asking their doctors, like, hey, this could be a possibility?
Yeah, we have actually had people reach out because they saw the tool. One woman doesn't actually have CF, but she has symptoms and signs that are treated very similarly. So there's something called non-CF bronchiectasis, and we use most of the same medicines. But she, again, had been misdiagnosed with asthma repeatedly and wasn't being treated for the signs and symptoms that she actually has. The reason she found us here at National Jewish was because of that tool, actually. Yeah, so I think it is. I think we need to get it out to more people. You know, there are always costs to such things when you're going to do, for example, a promo or whatever. So we continue to think about ways that we can get this in front of more people so that more people will be picked up.
And then is it correct? Because I think, since I've done a lot of work in low income and middle income countries where they're underdiagnosed, it seems to me there are so many more than 40,000 people in the United States because African Americans, Asians, Hispanics are so underdiagnosed. I mean, when I interviewed Dr. Grace Paul, who I'm sure you know, in India, she said there are about 140,000 people that probably have CF there. That's more than we're saying in the entire world right now. So,
right. Yeah, and there was actually a great article in the Journal of CF by Guo, it's Guo and colleagues, and they actually estimated the number of people that they think are undiagnosed across the world. And so we used to say there are about 80,000, and we're now thinking more like 180,000, for example, because of so many places not having access to the testing. And so therefore, and also not thinking it occurs in their country. So there are multiple case reports, and now there's actually a clinic in South Africa because people assume that it didn't occur in Africa, and now there's a clinic. And obviously you mentioned Dr. Nasser earlier. She's been going over to Egypt to help them with their diagnoses. So it's definitely higher than what we've said because we've missed people.
And one of the things she also said is that the Arabic community is also underdiagnosed here in the U.S. as well because their mutations aren't on newborn screening. So it's a huge problem. And even if you talk about it not on an emotional side, just from the insurance side, you would think that this would save them money. Let's get it all. Let's test everybody and start them early. It will save money. If we're only going to talk money, it makes sense. It will save so much money for the insurance companies. People will be healthier. They won't have to be hospitalized, hopefully, as much. So it baffles me that it's such a uphill battle to make it all happen.
Yeah, it's been, I try to remind myself that it took a long time for us to get in a position where we have all these systemic inequities, so we're not going to change them overnight. But I do feel hopeful that at least the conversations are happening and some steps have happened to start to move things forward.
And what else are you working on or looking forward to in the future of cystic fibrosis? And I guess in that question, I have so many questions, but the CF modulator isn't the cure. And I think a lot of people with CF, my two daughters included, and others are like, this isn't a cure. We're not never in the hospital anymore. But what are your hopes and thoughts for the future?
Well, one of the things I always tell people, even if they're doing really well on the modulators, this is not the last drug that you're going to be on because, like you said, it's not a cure. And also we want to make sure that we've developed effective therapies for every single person with CF. And so we're continuing to look at modulators and other types of modulators, but we're also really refocusing now on genetic-based therapies. So things like gene replacement, and in the very future, the far future, probably not right around the corner, but gene editing. And then in trials right now, we also have mRNA therapies that would go in, you'd inhale it, and it would tell your cell to make the protein the way it was meant to be made. And so therefore, hopefully, make you have less symptoms and less signs of CF. So these things are actually in trials again. So, back in 1989, when the gene was discovered, we all thought gene therapy would be around the corner because it would be straightforward because of the single gene disorder. Obviously, that didn't happen, but our technologies are much, much better now. And so I'm really hopeful that we're going to get one of these therapies through to the end line. And even if it's only a little bit effective in the beginning, like we saw some of the modulators being only a little bit effective, it did help stabilize people. And so if we could even find something that would stabilize people who don't currently have access to a modulator and then continue to work on getting better therapies, that's my dream.
That is great because it doesn't work for everyone, the one out there, and there are risks with it. And some people have had to choose between their emotional health and physical health because there were side effects. But it seems like there is a lot of hope out there in science, obviously.
Yeah, there's a ton of hope. And I think, Chris, this is one of the things that's near and dear to my heart. But one of the things that has been very clear that there is hope is how many more people are having children. So both males with CF who need to usually use assisted reproduction, but also females with CF, the pregnancy rate has just skyrocketed here in the US and around the world. And I think that reflects, one, the drugs are working really well and making it easier for people to become pregnant, but also the fact that people are looking towards their futures and seeing that they can have a family and have the things that they may not have thought they could have when they got diagnosed.
And are people still getting in the field of cystic fibrosis? Our foundation did a fellowship for the University of Michigan because they have fewer doctors that are coming into the field. And I also wondered, when they come into the field with people on modulators, are they not seeing the true CF? Are they thinking, oh, this isn't so bad? How is that going?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we're sort of in this transition period in multiple different ways. But one of them is that there weren't that many adults with CF back when I started training. There are a lot more now. And the CF Foundation recognized that and started creating adult centers. But if you look at the projections for the number of people with CF that are going to be alive because they're living so much longer over the next 20 years, again, it's just going higher and higher. So we're thinking not just 30,000 people or 40,000 in the United States, but 30 or 40,000 adults with CF. And right now we don't have enough physicians to take care of all of the people we need to take care of. And so I think we've been focusing on trying to involve more primary care doctors than we have in the past, and also more subspecialists for the issues that are going to come up. So of course you want to start colon cancer screening, for example, at 40. So we have a GI doctor or gastroenterologist who works with us, not just on things like reflux and distal intestinal obstructive syndrome, but also making sure people are getting their colonoscopies. So that's one issue. In terms of people going into training and whether they're getting the sufficient training. We do still have people do training in the hospital, and not everybody, one, has a modulator, and two, not everybody, as you said earlier, stays out of the hospital all the time, even if they are on a modulator. They may go less, but some still have to go. So we are trying to make sure that people have both the outpatient experience of CF, which is where most people are seen, but also still see some of the inpatient CF. But I think it is going to be a lot harder for the trainees coming through if they don't have that exposure, especially on the pediatric side, because if you start somebody on a highly effective modulator at age 2, you're unlikely for that person to ever have the major complications that we saw even in kids before. So we have to really focus on making sure that people have the adequate training that they need.
And, at the CFRI conference, I think it was July, I met some of the doctors that you mentioned, Dr. Susanna McCauley and Dr. Megan McGarry, and everyone that spoke, just brilliant people, just really smart. And I am so grateful that you and all of them are in this field. It was really exciting to hear everything that they had to say. And I just think we're in really good hands right now in this community, it seems like. And Visual's book, fantastic. And I think told the story so well to so many people.
Yes, it really did. I thought she did a great job of making it accessible to a huge variety of people who would be reading it.
And have you written any books at this point that are you going to start one? I just think you have so much to say and teach everybody about your journey, about everything that you're doing.
I have not written any books. It's not in my plans right now. There are lots of science articles I'm still trying to write, maybe when I'm retired.
Well, what do you do? It seems like you're always busy, you're always on call, you're always involved or at a conference or speaking. Do you have downtime? Do you have a family? Do you get to, because I always used to say to Dr. Nasser, do you have a life? Because I'm always talking to you, or you're flying back and forth to Egypt. Like, you and Dr. Nasser and all the other CF docs just give us so much time. So what is your life like?
Yeah, so I feel like, and I'm sure that others would agree with me, that being in this community is a huge privilege. So a lot of people go to work every day because they have to pay the bills, but I actually love what I do. I love doing the science. I love being part of this community. So it doesn't feel like work all the time. But I do actually have a family. I have a husband and 5 Rhodesian Ridgebacks that I train and show and very occasionally breed. And I also love diving because it's a very peaceful Zen sort of thing where you're just underwater looking at pretty fish and breathing, like meditation. And so I do that once a year, and I'm actually going on vacation next week. So
that is wonderful. And the dogs. So tell me about the dogs. What is their personality? Are they hunting dogs? I don't know anything about that breed of dog.
So Rhodesian Ridgebacks were actually originally bred to bay and hunt lions in the former Rhodesia. They are very, very smart. They're also really loyal to you, and they're a little bit protective, not overprotective like some of the working dogs, because they were bred to hunt. Like if they see small furry objects, they're going to try to chase it. So you have to pay attention when you're jogging with them. But they're hounds, and so they will go running with you, but then they'll also hang out on the couch and watch a football game with you quietly after you take them for a run. So their personalities are great for people who have the patience to do a lot of training with them up front. And they're also really beautiful. They have this hair that goes backwards on their back, and that's the ridge, and it was bred into them on purpose. So it's their hallmark.
Wow, they sound beautiful. I'm going to have to take a look at a picture of them. And 5 is a lot. Do they get along with each other and behave? And
yeah, they're all related. So I got my very first one in 2007. And so I bred her and then had her puppies and then on and on. So they're all related and they get along great. They adore each other.
That is wonderful. And I'm glad that you get to do things outside of the CF clinics, but really glad that you are in the CF community. Anything that you want to tell a person of color if they're suspecting maybe that they might have cystic fibrosis, or, somebody in the family might? Where do they reach out first?
So I would say that if you are thinking you might have a few signs and symptoms, the screening tool that Terry and Michelle and I worked on, if you go to noaacf.org, noaacf.org, you can download the screening tool. It's completely free for anybody of color or people who are white to download it and look through those questions and see if you're checking a lot of them. And if you are, I would take it to your primary care doctor and say, hey, I'm thinking about all the signs and symptoms I've been telling you about, and they match up with this list. Can you do a sweat test? So I would start with that and then going to your primary care doctor.
Wonderful advice. And that link is in the show notes also. So if people didn't remember it, they can go and click on it and be taken directly to that site. So Dr. Jennifer Taylor Cousar, thank you so much for joining us and sharing all the wealth of information that you have and what you do.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
The original music in this podcast is performed by Kevin Allen, who happens to have cystic fibrosis.
We all got our worries and fears. I know it's got you frustrated, but loving you is so alright.
This has been the Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast. For more information and to learn more about the Bonnell Foundation, visit our website at thebonnellfoundation.org. That's the BONNELL Foundation.org. This podcast was sponsored by Viatris, Genentech, and Vertex. It was produced by Jag and Detroit Podcasts. Follow our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now.